Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction with me, Beth Rigby.
Me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman.
Now, I am at home this week. I am not in a hotel. I'm meant to be holidaying, but there's been a bit of news knocking about this week, just a tiny bit of news. So they've had what someone's put as a Rigby recall. It sounds very grand, doesn't it? Because there is so much news going around. How can you rest when Donald Trump is in the White House like a relentless beast of the markets, or the market's beast in him? We'll get onto that. But I haven't been following Starmer. I have been trying to put my feet up a bit.
Balls. I'm going to call balls on that
Balls.
immediately because
Balls.
I know
Very
from
good.
your social media that you have been following Starmer around. You followed him all the way to the Emirates to watch Arsenal beat Real Madrid 3-0. My word.
Yeah, I did. Actually, someone sent me a very funny message on Instagram because I'd gone to the Real Madrid Arsenal game. I spent nearly all my savings on the tickets, I have to say. It was absolutely worth it. Oh my God, it was worth it. Anyway, I had the most amazing night, and I was putting up terrible video footage of all my crap videos through the night, and then someone messaged me on Instagram saying, I think you're taking following the Prime Minister around too far, because of course he likes to go to an Arsenal game. I mean, he must have been buzzing, actually, the Prime Minister, because not only did Arsenal beat Real Madrid 3-0, but then the next day he went to Bedford to announce a theme park. I mean, that is fun, isn't it?
He's almost turning into Ed Davey. Put him in a wetsuit, shove him on a paddleboard. He's Ed Davey.
Shall we move on from football and wet
No,
swimming
Harriet, let's
to
not.
the reason for the Rigby recall, which is massive news. And Beth is going to explain all about the bond markets and why Trump has had to back down, of course, although he's not admitting he's backed down. Having sat, I thought I was masking my exasperation effectively, because having sat every Monday night for 40 years of my life, listening to the men in the Parliamentary Labour Party all talking about football, which I felt was kind of socially exclusionary of me and the half dozen other women there, to find myself on an all-women podcast on football lovers has caused me a bit of a sort of anyway, we're going to talk about the economy
it's the
now.
national game.
Can I just say? Can I say, please forgive me, Harriet? Sorry,
But I think when women
that.
do it, is it different than when men do it? And should I have a different attitude? Well, I'll deal with that ideological conundrum another time. So just to recap in a very, very briefly. So we had Project 2025, which is the sort of ultra-Republican description of the new world that Donald Trump would create if he got elected. So that was all set out in Project 2025. And everybody said, take it seriously, but don't take it literally. Of course, Donald Trump's not going to actually do all of that. Well, in January, he gets inaugurated. In February, his vice president goes along to NATO and says, you're all laggards and we're not going to be contributing in the way we were before. And that completely upends security relationships in the middle of the Ukraine, Putin invasion of the Ukraine. And it also affects our economies. That's February. Then in March, he says, right, next stop is tariffs. And just this month, April, just last week, we have Liberation Day. So all of these things are happening in such rapid succession with huge implications. And then what happens when we have Liberation Day? We have the imposition of tariffs. Then we have the world's reaction. Then we have the market's reaction. Then we have Trump's reaction. And what we have got, to say it's economic instability is to understate it. We have got economic upheaval, unpredictability and instability, and in a way that has really not been seen before. It really even puts what Liz Truss managed to do when the market closed her premiership down. It really puts that, it pales in comparison.
Yeah, I would like to try and explain it a bit. It's like being sort of slapped around the face with a wet fish. It's just so discombobulating. And Trump really has been tamed by the markets. And what I mean by that is that he announced his tariffs. They kicked in on Wednesday morning. And at that point, the bond markets began a big sell-off, or basically people that invest in government bonds. Now, to try and explain this to you a bit, like government bonds are effectively US debt. Bondholders basically hold IOUs from the US government in return for funding US trade and their capital deficit. And what happened on Wednesday morning is, think about it like this. 2 years ago, you had the energy crisis shock with the war in Ukraine. 5 years ago, you had a market shock with the pandemic. And everyone woke up on Wednesday morning and the tariffs are in effect. It's the biggest protectionism in a century. And you think about what happened in the UK when Liz Truss announced her mini budgets and the markets reacted badly, and suddenly the cost of borrowing goes up because bond investors are getting nervous. And basically, they start selling off the bonds. And this is what caused Donald Trump to have to pause. And I know that Trump's team was saying, oh, this is the art of the deal.
It was literally something that they weren't going to do when they woke up that morning.
He did seem to, I think, acknowledge that market fear of a trade war had actually prompted the change.
I thought that people were jumping a little bit out of line. They were getting yippy, They were getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid, unlike these champions, because we have a big job to do. No other president would have done what I did. No other president. I know the presidents, they wouldn't have done it. Watching the bond market is very tricky. I was watching it, but if you look at it now, it's beautiful. The bond market right now is beautiful. But yeah, I saw last night where people were getting a little queasy.
And really, it's the bond market won, Donald Trump nil. He had no option but to do this. And it reminded me of something James Carville, who's one of President Clinton's former advisors. He said, if I would ever to come back in a reincarnation, I'd want to come back as the bond market because you can intimidate everyone. And even the bond market managed to stop Trump in his tracks. It's just extraordinary that it's a massive U-turn, however he tries to frame it.
Right, listeners, you're really blessed, actually, because as it happens in terms of this pod, you've got Beth, that used to be a financial journalist at the Financial Times, that understands all of this stuff, as well as pretty much anyone out there. You've got Harriet, who has been in these rooms when stuff happens, when the world shakes across the Atlantic and Britain has to react, that can talk about all of this. And then you've got me, who's not an expert in any of this stuff whatsoever, but can ask lots of questions. I mean, I think the stuff that is probably kind of got in people's heads is, well, one, if they're anything like me, they went to bed on Wednesday night and all tariffs had been suspended for 90 days. And they got up on Thursday morning and actually the UK's position hadn't changed. It still had 10% tariff and it still had 25% on cars. And they don't really kind of understand why the FTSE, which is the London Stock Exchange for the 100 biggest companies, the 250 next biggest companies, why that was soaring when actually the UK's position hadn't changed, even though lots of other countries were getting a sort of better deal. They don't kind of get the bond market they heard of. They get that it reacts badly when people do mad stuff, like Liz Truss, like Donald Trump, and that it's got huge power. But who's buying or selling government bonds that can make it move? Like, who wants to buy a bond on its way down when you know it hasn't cratered yet? Like, this is trillions of dollars. Like, who's got that kind of money? How does that sort of thing work? And also, how is it that it has so much power that it can force world leaders who are ideological about stuff? And that's the kind of, even though what Truss and Trump have done have been very, very different, but they're both very ideological about it. They believe in it, who genuinely think that what they're doing is right and that the rest of the world will bend to their vision of it and that it's going to be a brighter future for everybody, even though the best economists in the world are telling them that this is madness, that it's wrong. How is it this one element, this one kind of mechanism within global finance that has so much power?
I think the thing about if you think about the bond market, all countries have huge levels of debt, right? And we are the same. And investors are basically your creditors, put their money into what they think are safe bets. And they think the US economy is a safe bet. So the US benefits from being able to borrow money very cheaply. Investors get nervous and say, oh, US debt is looking more and more risky, and they begin to sell off the debt. And then the knock-on of that is that the debt gets more expensive to fund. That goes from Wall Street to Main Street, if you like, which is kind of ordinary Americans, because so their mortgages, there's a knock on it. If you mortgages get more expensive, credit card debt gets more expensive because the cost of borrowing in your country is going up. Donald Trump just had to press pause on this. That he was, as much as he thought it was a good idea, the bond markets took fright and it was going to have a real effect on the US economy. I mean, I would say as well that whether he stopped it or not, what he has unleashed is absolute chaos, and that will have effect on ordinary Americans. I should say, just in terms of what he actually announced, it was a bit confusing because he announced it on Truth Social. At first, I thought he'd paused all tariffs. He hadn't done that. What he'd actually done was all of those reciprocal tariffs that he put on countries that he thought were unfairly trading with the US. He basically stopped all the higher tariffs. So you remember that, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, dozens of countries had really high reciprocal tariffs. He dropped those all back to 10% tariffs, which is what the UK had. So they all, everyone's on a flat 10% tariffs, apart from China, where he increased the tariffs to, I think, 125%. So actually, and on things like automotives, where he put a 25% tariff in, that doesn't change. So actually, for the UK, nothing changed. But for other countries such as Japan or Vietnam, some African nations, in fact, there were dozens of them, I can't remember them all, they went from having these tariffs slapped on them of, like the EU, for example, 20%, and it was then halved to 10%.
So what we've learned from that is two things. Firstly, that if you've got a leader of a country versus the markets, and if the markets are hostile to an action that a leader of a country's taken, the markets win, even if it's the leader of the largest economy in the world. But we also know that he's still there. So what happened when Liz Truss, crashed our economy was that she was out. The markets won, and she had to draw back and fire the Chancellor and go back on what she'd done. But she was then out. What we've got in this situation is Trump has done this, has engendered the hostility of the markets. They've made him pause, but he is still there. He is an ever-present danger. And that shows a real kind of weakness in the actuality of the American Constitution, American politics.
It's much harder to get rid of a sitting US president than it is to get rid of a sitting UK Prime Minister.
That's the point, is that once the president has been directly elected, there is very little that can be done to get rid of him, irrespective of how disastrous he is, short of impeachments. In this country, there is any number of things. The cabinet can do a vote of no confidence, then the prime minister's out. The House of Commons can do a vote of no confidence, then the prime minister's out. Within an individual party, they can actually, in the Tory party, put in letters. In the Labour Party, they can have a vote of no confidence in the Parliamentary Labour Party. But anyway, so what we've learnt is that whilst the markets can stop him doing something, he is still in place and represents an ever-present danger.
Harriet, also listening to you talking about checks and balances, I go back to sort of studying politics many, many years ago, and how the US system was meant to be set up with the executive, the president, the legislature, Congress, and then the judiciary, the Supreme Court. And this was meant to be safeguarding democracy because each branch of government was checked by another. And what you're seeing with Trump is, because he controls Congress and as president, because he can take executive orders based on emergencies, and declare an emergency and just take these decisions unilaterally, as you said, that how fragile the checks and balances now become. And it does sort of astonish me that he can just do this with massive repercussions.
He's got that clean sweep, and that's why when you've got people like Elon Musk going, we need to impeach judges, and at the moment, because they control Congress, because they control the executive branch, if they start politicising the bench, the judiciary, then they've got that clean sweep, and that's where it becomes properly dangerous. But as exciting and as interesting as US politics is, and how much I can get my geek on for that, and I can get my geek on, I really can. We really have to talk about, I think, after the break, about how Starmer's reacted, how the UK government has played this in comparison with other people around the world, and whether it is working. So let's take a little moment, and then let's take it from the White House into number 10.
So I was scrambling around as Trump made this announcement, trying to get a reaction from the government. And it did take a bit of a while because they were blindsided just like everyone else by the announcement. And they came back with a pretty stock answer, which was about an hour and a half after President Trump made the announcement on the pause. A number 10 spokesperson said a trade war is in nobody's interest. We don't want any tariffs at all. So for jobs and livelihoods across the UK, we will coolly and calmly continue to negotiate Britain's interest. And when I talk to a few people in government, they argue that this is a vindication. Trump's decision was a vindication of Starmer's approach, which was to not retaliate, to take time and see if this unwound. So I think they felt vindicated because Trump's whole argument was those countries that haven't retaliated, I'm going to give you the 10% rate apart from China. I mean, but Harriet, do you think Starmer's been vindicated?
I think there's a danger in when something really big is happening to your country and something big is happening to the UK because of what's happening in America and because what's happening in the global economy and because of its effect on our economy. There's a risk if the Prime Minister and the government is not leading the narrative, leading the story about what is actually happening. We know what the government is not doing. They're not panicking. They're obviously right not to panic. We know that they're keeping cool heads because they're saying that and every minister is saying it. And we know that they're saying a trade war is not where we want to be. But they don't seem to be able to be telling the country what I think the country needs to hear them saying, which is that what Trump is doing is a bad thing. That they need to show that judgment about it's not okay for somebody in the largest economy in the world to wreak havoc, not only in their own country, but on our country and the rest of the global economy. And I think that there is a danger if the Prime Minister, who is the leader of the country, is not telling the story about what is actually happening. And I don't mean gratuitous insults, but I mean actually owning the narrative. And this was a very small example back when we were in government after 97, when the US put steel tariffs on our country. And we did say, Tony Blair as Prime Minister did say, this is unacceptable, this is wrong, it's unjustified, it's breaching the World Trade Organization rules, and was able to say, we do not believe this is how you should be within the World Trade Organization, and Bush has got it wrong. And I think there's something that it feels as if there's a kind of restricted vocabulary amongst ministers at the moment where they are speaking in code. This is not where we want to be. We don't want to see a trade war. We're for open markets, but they're not able to say about the elephant in the room, which is that Trump is wrong on this. We don't agree with him. But the other thing I think they should be doing is they should be being more positive and giving reassurance. I think the story needs to be told to the country that this is a really difficult problem and Trump has caused it and he is wrong to do this, but we will be okay with this government. And I think he's entitled to say that, and I think people will want to hear that. And that is not going to be Pollyanna-ish, but it's just the reassurance. We have got a lot going for us here, and they will not let that be jeopardised.
I hadn't actually thought of that, Harriet, and that's really interesting because I was going to say, it would be the easiest thing in the world for me from a different political party to the government to say, look, what's all this got them? All this kissing butts, all this grabbing the ankles. Other people have been a bit more bellicose, a bit more belligerent about this. And for the next 90 days at least, we're all in the same boat. We've all got 10%, we've all got 25% on cars. We're no better off than other countries who've been a lot sharper in that. But I was actually going to give Starmer a bit of credit for being able to portray not overreacting, not reacting quickly, not grabbing the nearest microphone, being very steady, making sure there's message discipline with all of his cabinet and all the rest of it. I was going to give him a lot of credit for that because I have found it reassuring. And I think they've done a good job in saying, look, we are working behind the scenes, we are talking to our opposite numbers, particularly at officials level, and the briefing. So the briefing part is the stuff that you read in all the newspapers and you have all of the people on the news telling you about in broadcast, but there's no quotations around it. You don't see a minister saying it. It is spokespeople from the government saying, look, lads, behind the scenes, we're working on a trade deal. Now, we might not get it. We understand we might not get it, but we're working really hard and these negotiations are still going on. And I think the information flow from Number 10 has been probably about right. I think they've done quite a good job here. I think the problem is, as this goes on, they've got to have more to say. They've been in a bit of a holding pattern. And you're right, Harriet, they do need to have a bit more to say. And they need to make a choice about whether they say this is dangerous, but you'll be safe with us, or whether they say there are opportunities here that we want to pursue that will be good for us or better for us. And they've got to make a decision about what that is. And I think that they haven't decided yet because they don't know yet, because they're waiting to see which way Trump jumps. And the real issue, I think, is that the entire world is holding their breath because of one man's whimsy. And that is terrifying because we've got another 3 3/4 years of this.
And I agree that the government shouldn't be doing a constant negative running commentary and reaction to everything that's coming out of the White House. But I do think that he needs to step forward to tell the national story about what is actually happening at the moment, what the bigger picture is, and provide strong reassurance about what they are going to do.
On all of that, it is interesting because the government said at the beginning of the Trump arrival into the White House that they weren't going to talk about domestic matters and they were going to try not to comment or have a running commentary on things Trump said or did, but that, you know, we're less than 100 days into his second term and the turmoil he's unleashed across the world, it's having a direct impact on everyone's lives and raising up, you know, risks of jobs and so on. And we've had this this from one of our listeners. I mean, this is how kind of talking about the government and its narrative and talking to the public. This is what Juliet sent in to us. Let's have a listen.
Hi, ladies. Thanks for the tariff chat this week, especially the impact on us in the UK. I know it's going to be really impactful on loads of people in this country, but I wanted to let you know that for me and my husband, we're both 63, our pensions have gone down about 10% this week. Clearly, that's going to have a big effect on us and when we choose to retire and start drawing down on our pensions. So thanks, Donald Trump. Really appreciate it. Hi again, ladies. I sent that message before Trump's U-turn on tariffs, but thought it might be useful to let you know that since then, my pension's gone down even more. I think it's gone down 5k more.
I mean, she speaks for millions of people around the world and in the US too. And this comes back to this thing about Main Street and the way in which Trump's decisions affect markets, because what's happening is, and Juliet's pension's gone down again, so it is a really nerve-wracking time.
When Finn was born, I took my BBC pension. I had about 6-7 years worth of pension sitting in a pot. I took it out and shoved it in a SIP so it could be invested. And just watching how it goes up and down is wild. I'm 20 years off retirement. I can't imagine what it's like being 2 years off retirement and then suddenly seeing all the plans you make being hit by thousands of pounds. And so it's almost like a salary cut for when you retire, if you know what I mean, and not being able to budget because some guy thousands of miles away is pulling levers and then saying, actually, no, for 90 days we're going to stop. I mean, it is kind of madness. And I think when you've got these people for whom it materially matters, like Juliet that was just on that voice note there, I mean, you know, Beth, you've been talking to people in and around the government themselves. I mean, do they understand what this is like on a personal level for people out there?
If you go back to kind of the Rachel Reeves approach and you ask people in government what they will say to you, and this goes back to actually what Harriet said on the pod last week, is that stability becomes king, because what you want to try and project onto the world stage and also to voters is that while the markets or, you know, trade is going to hell in a handcart, we in the UK, we are the UK government and we are being, you know, to quote Theresa May, a bit ill-fated that, but strong and stable. You know, I raised the question about the fact that the economic outlook would only worsen because of this, and would that force Rachel Reeves to either borrow more, that would be to change her fiscal rules, tax more, or cut spending in order to react to that? That was the kind of question we were talking about. Now, when you go back to people in government, and what you heard the Prime Minister say really explicitly this week was that the fiscal rules will not change, which is what, Harriet, you quite rightly were talking about last week. And when I speak to people in government and I say, well, why don't you change the fiscal rules? This is what one government source said. They said, things are turbulent, but we need to try and show business that despite everything that's going on in the world, this is quoting someone, not verbatim, but that the UK is still a good place to do business, and that in a world that is becoming more volatile and unstable, there's even greater reason for the UK to try and project stability. But I think that they do understand, as Harriet has pointed out, that they need to articulate a narrative more. So I think what we're going to see in the next few weeks is a few things. Number one, it will be, can we get the deal done? The second thing is immediate support for sectors. So you saw an announcement this week about electrical vehicles. I think that they are trying to work with business to work out what support needs to be given to try and offset some of the worst effects of these tariffs coming in. And then I think what we're going to see in the coming weeks is a lot of, you're going to get sick to death of hearing further and faster. We must go further and faster. So I think, there's a spending review coming in June. That's when the government sets out their 3-year spending plan. Can some of that be brought forward? So if there's capital infrastructure projects, transport projects, money for housing, money to build new small nuclear reactors, etc., will they try and ramp that up in order to try and project a sense of, we're cracking on? And Harriet, I'm really interested to see if you agree with me or disagree. They're being really strong on the fiscal rules. Where they're being less clear is on tax rises, because what they're now sort of talking about is, if you ask them about tax rises, they'll say, we're not going to write 4 years of budgets, etc. But, the government might have to find other sources of funding if the economy shrinks. That is fair, isn't it? And if she rules out fiscal rules, changing those, i.e. borrowing more, there's only 2 other routes to go, and that's either tax rises or spending cuts.
My instinct is that she will be less likely to want to raise extra in tax and more predisposed to keep cutting the increase in public spending. And I don't think she'll break the fiscal rules. It might be that there are pockets of things where there could be revenue raising here and there. But I think another big tax raising budget she's not going to want to do, partly for the reasons that you mentioned, Beth, is that she wants, and Keir Starmer wants, this to be a predictable government. And for her to be a predictable chancellor at a time when there is so much instability and chaos, there is an absolute premium on stability and predictability.
I'm thinking about where this goes next. And I know that it's crazy. I know it's madness to try and second guess Trump. But actually with this pause, what he's done is he's now isolated China and has demonstrated that it's really China and Chinese exports that he's trying to get hold of. When they really don't like a country, Americans have a bit of a history of exerting all of their effort that they can. So when they hated Cuba under the Castro administration, they had something called Helms-Burton, which wasn't just a trade embargo with them and sanctions and all the rest of it. It went even further. And there was bits of it that said, we will refuse to trade with people who trade with Cuba. And they used their might to try and do that. And I can see, and it got kind of relaxed under Obama a bit, and then it tightened up under Trump the last time around. They tightened it up again when he came in. We just haven't heard much about it because there's been so much other stuff going on. But it strikes me as if this would be the next logical step.
Ruth, I think you're absolutely spot on in that. And I think what's happened is everyone's sort of whirling around what does the pause in tariffs mean and why is that related to the bond markets? But he is massively taking aim at China. And President Xi just is clear. He's like, I'm not going to be bullied by President Trump. And while other economies around the world do have to allow themselves to be bullied by Donald Trump, but also at the end of the day, for the world, for people like Juliet with her pension, a massive trade war between the world's two largest economy just hurts everybody, not least because China will be trying to dump product all around the world, and that affects other economies as well. And it just stops the flow of trade and it makes everyone poorer.
And there is this sort of grand philosophy of what globalisation and freer trade was supposed to be. It was a concept born out the Second World War generally, which was the idea behind it was not only does it make goods cheaper and, it makes the pound in the pocket that somebody earns go further, so it raises all living standards. It was also this idea that if you have an interconnected world, you are less likely to take arms against your neighbour because you need them.
But I think at the moment what we're seeing is a Trump climbing down as the sort of reality of what's happened in the markets hits him hard. Let's see what happens next.
Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you might notice that 3 is down to 2. Harriet's had to leg it. This was a hastily assembled, because there's so much going on in the world, get-together of us, that's why we're all in different places, to explain to you that are listening and haven't seen the empty microphone that's sitting there. She's headed off. She's a very busy lady. But we're also going to be busy, and we're going to have a reunion on a stage, and hopefully with you joining us.
Yeah, that's right. So we are going to reassemble for a live show. We're going to be at Cadogan Hall on Tuesday, the 20th of May, for one night only. Tickets are on sale now, and you know what to expect from us by now. We'll have all of our usual political chat. I'm going to explain to you why Harriet sometimes goes by the name of Jane. I might explain that actually on the pod. I discovered this recently.
It has nothing to do with Tarzan and Michael Heseltine's nickname being that. Just to clear up for anybody, because that's where my mind went.
I think let's reimagine it like that. Actually, that's much more fun. That's even better than the real reason. Anyway. It is really fun. You'll get all our usual chat. We'll answer loads of your questions. We might get in slightly sticky spots, which actually makes it fun. And we will have a very special guest joining us on the stage for the night.
And we try and get our special guest drunk at half time as well, at the intervals, just so that they tell us more things in the second half than they mean to.
It's true. We try not to get ourselves drunk though. Now, ticket details are in the show notes for this episode, and you can find more details online. Just go to aegpresents.co.uk. Come and join us. It will be fun.
Indeed. Anyway, that is it from today. Next week, we'll be answering some of your questions as an Easter treat. So do remember to send us your messages to the burner phone. The number is on WhatsApp 07934 200 444. That's 07934 200 444. Or you can email us on electoraldysfunction@sky.uk.
You've got to say goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.